Hello. The scandal around a star and the dreadful disaster in Libya. There's plenty to talk about this morning, at home and abroad.
A city swept away. Floods in Libya, only days after a huge earthquake in Morocco. Thousands and thousands of lives lost. Natural challenges. And perhaps dangerous diplomatic ones too. Russia and North Korea's leaders side by side. An alleged Chinese spy roving our parliament.
Probation, prison, schools, China. Yet again, inaction man fails to heed the warning.
Labour faces its own questions about tougher talk on immigration. Glad handing in The Hague and across the pond.
I don't think it's credible that he really wants to grip this problem.
So our main question this morning, how should our politicians handle relations around the world?
Who better to answer that than the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly? And is this the most powerful man in Labour that most people have never heard of? Pat McFadden, who's in charge of Keir Starmer's election campaign. And plans to make the online world safer are about to become law after tireless work by campaigners like Ian Russell. His daughter Molly took her own life when her world turned dark online. He's with us this morning. Morning. With me at the desk, the journalist Jane Moore, author and storyteller Irvine Welsh, and Nimco Ali, activist and former Conservative advisor. Good morning to all of you. Let's start, as ever, with a look at what's making the news. And almost all of the newspapers today splash with allegations of rape and sexual abuse made against the presenter Russell Brand. It's been painstaking work by the Sunday Times and Channel 4 over a long period of time. Their headline, Russell Brand, the sex predator who hid in plain sight. But a couple of the other papers take a different tack. The Observer splashes with Labour wanting a new EU links in a reset of policy. The Sunday Express goes on the NHS, suggesting 1 million people have ditched the service to go private. Now, let's start then with the biggest story of the day, these allegations against Russell Brand, which he has denied. But Jane, you've actually worked with him. I mean, just what kind of person is he?
Well, it depends. I mean, I worked with him years ago in what I think he would freely admit were his drink and drug years. Very compelling personality, sort of takes over the room. My more recent experiences with him have been a much more sort of humble person, somebody who's obviously got married, had children, slightly reinvented himself. So, you know, reading it, it's like, will the real Russell Brand please stand up? And yeah, I mean, I know we're going to talk about it later, but yeah, it's a year of investigation and pretty damaging stuff.
And he's a very big figure. He was someone who was hugely popular for a long time, and then Irvine sort of made himself as a kind of health guru. You also were friends with him at some point. I mean, what did you think when you saw all of this?
Yeah, obviously it's shocking when anybody, when these allegations are made against anybody, and you know, he's always been a flamboyant shagger, basically, who became the kind of, you know, settled down, and he's, you know, sort of, and, you know, it's like, but you can't really kind of condemn anybody or witch hunt them for sexual promiscuity, but, you know, these are really, really serious charges. As I said, you know, you never know what's going on with people. They never present in any kind of way. That's the heinous nature of those kind of crimes. I mean, I worked with Harvey Weinstein, and I just thought he was this kind of sort of generic kind of Hollywood buffoon. I didn't really see him as a sex predator, but obviously people don't advise that kind of thing. So you never. The unfortunate thing about it is you never know with anybody.
And Russell Brand has very strongly denied. He said all of the relationships he had were consensual, but it is a major story that's getting people talking this morning. Let's turn then to politics, because we're about to talk to the Foreign Secretary. Now, Nimco, you have advised the Conservatives. You have been a Conservative, but you've sort of fallen out of love with him lately. What's the kind of thing that you would like to hear from the Foreign Secretary?
I advised the Home Secretary, so that was the thing that I was really interested in. It didn't really matter whether they were Conservative or Labour at the time. It was that I cared about the fact that getting the violence against women and girls strategy right. And I think one of the things that I'd love to hear from the Foreign Secretary is, as he heads to UNGA, is the fact that we need to talk about violence against women and girls. And I think this is the key thing with the whole Russell Brand allegation as well. I think we have to remember that sexual violence is a global pandemic.
OK, well, he will be heading to the UN General Assembly in New York tonight, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in a second. But top of the list for many people looking at things happening around the world are the images coming out of Libya, which are almost too awful to absorb after the devastating floods there. But it is real. Villages are gone, thousands of lives swept out to sea. We'll hear from James Cleverly in a second, but our colleague Anna Foster of the BBC is on the ground in what was the city of Derna, and she's shared her impressions with us.
Morning, Laura. Morning, everyone. I wanted to try and really show you what it's like to be standing here in Derna at the moment, and you can see already that the level of destruction, the way that buildings have just been completely smashed and destroyed by the force of this water. But what that doesn't show you, and what I wanted you to see, was just how widespread this damage is. If I start to turn around, this is what was the Wadi, the river that ran through Derna, and look, it's completely gone. Everything is destroyed. It's like a wasteland, and this was a narrow channel that has just widened out and taken everything with it. Buildings, cars, thousands and thousands of people. And if I move a little bit further around, you can see this is the only way now to get across the river. There are people walking on foot, there are cars going across this bumpy and jagged road, because there's really nowhere near enough aid here either. And you can see, really, at this stage, you would expect there to be so many more trucks, so many more people. There are lots of local Libyans doing what they can here. But when you look back upstream to where that dam burst, and those thousands and thousands and thousands of litres of water just came pouring down this area, it really shows you how desperate the situation is for the survivors. They just don't have what they need.
A terrible 360-degree reality of what's happening on the ground in Derna. Welcome to you, Foreign Secretary. We heard there from Anna and our team on the ground, and we've spoken to some other sources who say there isn't enough expertise there yet. There isn't enough technology. They want that kind of help. What is the UK giving, and when can it arrive?
Well, I mean, firstly, the situation there, I think, is very difficult for most people to comprehend the scale of the damage, and we've seen some of it there. One of the big challenges with Libya is, unlike in other areas where the UK has been able to join other countries in supporting, for example, during the Turkish earthquakes or during the recent earthquakes in Morocco. In both those countries, there was a high-functioning government that we could liaise with, that we could plug into, that we could coordinate with. Sadly, in that eastern part of Libya, we just don't have that. And that is why we are not seeing the international support on the ground as we would wish. The UK's allocated £1 million already. We are contributing an additional 10 million to help across the wider North African region, both Morocco and Libya. And we've got an emergency medical team who are deploying, and we will look at what more we can do.
But people have been asking on the ground for expertise, for technology, for trained rescuers. From what you've said, does that mean actually it is impossible for the UK to get that help there?
So I'm not going to say it is impossible, of course not, but it is so much harder. And in the conversations that I've had in the past where we've deployed aid experts, it's not just about sending them. That's the bit that we see. But of course, they have to be received in country. They have to have the logistics. They have to be able to get to the right place. They have to have authorities to liaise with. And in eastern Libya at the moment, many of those things are just not in place. That makes it so much harder.
But does the UK bear any responsibility for what is now happening in Libya, which is basically run by two rival factions? You've expressed how difficult that makes it to help. But the UK intervened in Libya to remove Gaddafi. in place there are these two warring factions, really. Do we bear a special responsibility, therefore, to try to do help, not just to throw up our hands and say, sorry, it's too hard?
No. So first of all, we're not being fatalistic about this. We will continue to do whatever we can to help. We will continue working with international partners. In fact, I discussed this on my recent trip to Ankara with the Turkish authorities who are seeking to help. Colonel Gaddafi perpetrated brutality, not just on his own people, but more broadly. Libya has not recovered from the civil war that raged across that country for many, many years. The UK played an active part. I personally played an active part through what's known as the Berlin process, which is an international coalition to try and bring about elections, to try and get a high-functioning government. But unfortunately, as we're seeing, we've not been successful.
But does that mean that the UK has a particular responsibility, though, to try to help now?
Well, the whole international community is working towards this. And of course, we want to play our part. We do not pretend that we can do that on our own. We are a significant player, and our assistance is often sought after because we have such expertise. We cannot do this alone, and it is particularly difficult in these circumstances.
Let's talk then about the UK's role. You say the UK is often called on, and that is certainly the case. But actually, your department, under your leadership, has cut the amount that's being spent on aid. What do you think the consequence of that is? Because if you look at the numbers, in 2019 we spent £15 billion a year on foreign aid. Now it is £12 billion in 2022.
So we've got to recognise that our official development assistance, our aid budget, in your shorthand, is basically defined by the scale of our economy. And our economy, like every other country in the world, was very significantly hit by COVID. We've got to respond to that. That said, we are still one of the largest aid donors in the world.
But that's not my question. The aid budget has gone down. Is there a consequence to that?
Well, you can never reduce budgets without any consequences at all. What we have done is we have made sure the money that we spend leverages in other international money. We are driving innovation in things like the World Bank and other international financial institutions. We are making sure that we maximise the effectiveness of our development budget.
But a third of that money, which our viewers might know, is actually being spent in the UK on asylum seekers or refugees who come here. So less money is being spent. A third of it is being spent at home. Do you accept then that actually the UK's spending power to help the most vulnerable people in the world is significantly diminished? I mean, that's what your own organisation, the Independent Commission for Aid Impact, which is a government-run body, said the UK's role is diminished. It says the UK's reputation has been undermined, and it says there's been a severe impact on the amount of help the UK can provide. Do you accept that?
Well, of course, when we are forced to reduce our spending, that has implications.
Well, you're not forced to. That's a political choice. It may be right or wrong, but it is a political decision where to put the money, and you have taken money out of international aid.
So the official development assistance, a lot of people think, and I almost slipped up myself, think of it as overseas development assistance. But the definition of what is ODA expenditure is defined internationally. And the money we spend, I think is absolutely right that we spend money supporting people fleeing conflict, as, for example, people fleeing Ukraine.
But the question is whether you accept that with a cut to the budget and a third of that aid budget being spent in the UK, rightly or wrongly, but do you accept the verdict of an independent organisation funded by taxpayers that has said the UK's reputation has been undermined and there has been a severe impact on our capacity to help people in need?
So the point is, when you have less money to spend, of course it has an impact, but what we have done through the time that I've been Foreign Secretary is to make sure that we are maximising the use of what we have got to spend. And we are still one of the largest aid donors in the world, both by percentage and in absolute terms. Even in these most difficult times, and I think it's worth people understanding this, even in the most difficult times, we are still spending more on ODA, Official Development Assistance, as a percentage of our GNI than at any year under the Labour government.
But this independent report has said that there's been a severe impact on the ability to help the world's most vulnerable people. It says spending here is an inefficient use of the aid budget.
Well, so I respect but disagree, because we are driving forward efficiencies. We are making money work hard. I'll give you an example on a trip that I went to Sierra Leone, where my mother is from, and I looked at a project where we had invested in a commercial investment, in a forestry investment, good husbandry of the natural environment, and as a byproduct of that, a huge increase in the number of women that were employed, and because those women were becoming the people bringing money into the household, they had more authority in their household, which diminished sexual violence in the household.
But that's one specific project.
Exactly, but we do lots of projects like that.
But do you accept that the UK's role on the world stage has been diminished by these decisions?
Well, the point I'm making is that all financial decisions have implications. If you have less money, you have implications. But the point I'm making is, we don't just sit back and go, well, life is tough. What we do is we do something about it.
OK, let's talk about a different subject then. Let's talk about China. So, huge concern about what's happened here in the last few months. When it was revealed last weekend, there was a parliamentary staffer who was arrested on allegations of spying for China. Just want to play people a quick clip of what happened at Prime Minister's Questions this week.
Sure.
Did the Foreign Secretary raise this specific case when he visited China? Yes or no?
Mr. Speaker, I'll refer to my previous answer, where I've said very clearly that the Foreign Secretary raised these issues with the Chinese Foreign Minister who he met, as did I when I had my meeting with Premier Li over the weekend.
Now, the Prime Minister said you raised these issues, but just to clear this up, did you raise the specific case of the arrest of somebody alleged to spy for China in Parliament?
Well, Laura, as you know, we do not comment on intelligence or security related matters. The Prime Minister is absolutely right that both he and I raised with the Chinese authorities their actions which are seeking to undermine or distort our democracy.
Well, hang on. Your officials were happy to brief that you raised the case of Jimmy Lai. The Prime Minister's team was happy to say in India that he'd raised the case of a Scottish Sikh, Jagtar Singh Johal. Sometimes politicians are absolutely willing to tell us what they raised in meetings. So did you or did you not raise the specific case
neither
of
those
cases,
cases
in Parliament?
So both of those cases are consular issues which we raise, and in a number of instances with consular cases, but not all, we publicise the fact we raised them. On intelligence and security matters, we do not comment.
But the Prime Minister and you have been happy to say you raised these issues, so you are therefore by implication talking about intelligence and security related issues. Did you or did you not raise the specific case?
You can keep asking and I keep giving the same answer. We do not comment on intelligence and security related issues.
So would our viewers be wrong to take from that you did not raise this case specifically with the Chinese authorities?
No, what I'm saying is we don't comment on intelligence and security related issues.
When did you first know about this?
We don't comment on security and intelligence related issues.
Well, the government did speak about this last week. Rishi Sunak said that he'd raised the issues at the summit and the G20. He did.
So we raise, as I said, we raise the sanctity of our democracy. We raise the issues of any kind of interference in our democracies. We always highlight the importance that all countries, including China, adhere to their Vienna Convention obligations. That's the rules that dictate how governments interact and nations interact with each other. So we do raise these issues of concern. But as I say, I am not going to, the Prime Minister will not, and no matter how many times you ask me to, I won't talk about intelligence or security issues.
Could you clarify one last thing, though? Were you aware of this case when you made the decision to go to China?
Again, I'm not going to comment on intelligence and security related issues.
But this is of great concern to people in your party who look at what you and Rishi Sunak are doing about China, and everyone understands they're important economically, but they just think you're not being tough enough, you're not being explicit enough about the threat. Some people in your own party believe that.
Yes, and the point that I have said is that we have to engage directly with China. There are a number of issues, including, for example, the sanctioning of British parliamentarians and a number of other issues, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and you know, the importance of respecting each other's democratic systems or political systems, in their case, rather than democratic systems. So, of course, we do raise these issues, and the best way of raising them is face to face. So pretending China doesn't exist and disengaging is not a credible policy. That is why we have these conversations, so that we can have the difficult conversations.
OK, we are having a face-to-face with you here in the studio this morning. There's a couple of things I'd just like to ask you briefly about before we close. Now, you were a proud member of the London Assembly before you became an MP. I want to ask you about the Conservative candidate to become Mayor of London, Susan Hall. Now, it emerged this week in January 2019. She retweeted a post from Katie Hopkins, which referred to the Mayor, Sadiq Khan, as the Mayor of Londonistan. And in February 2020, she liked a tweet depicting Enoch Powell with the words, "It's never too late to get London back." Are you comfortable with those comments, and do they represent the views of the modern Conservative Party?
So I haven't seen those specific things. I'm always very cautious about commenting without seeing them directly myself. But
I can tell you what they are.
So I don't. So I know Susan. I've worked with her for a very, very long time. She is like most of us in the Conservative Party. She is,
So you agree with those views?
She is someone who is comfortable working with people across all the ethnic representation of both the city and the country. She is passionate about making sure that London is a safe, a prosperous place for people to live in and work in. And she has been ferocious in highlighting Sadiq Khan's ineptitude as Mayor of London.
But would you endorse calling London Londonistan?
So the point is, of course, I wouldn't. But without seeing her explanation as to what happened there, I mean, I'm uncomfortable with speculating about the exact circumstances of that. But the point is, I know she is passionate about London and all Londoners, as are we.
OK. And I just finally want to ask you about the scandal around Russell Brand and this alleged appalling behaviour. Now, some years ago, actually, you described him as a vacuous narcissist. But I wonder, in a wider sense, do you think, from what we know now, that there are wider questions that the entertainment industry must answer?
So I think there are some real challenges where you have these very, very acute differentials in power, whether that be in the entertainment industry, whether that be in politics, and we see this in the commercial world as well. And I think we have to be particularly careful when we listen to the voices of the people who are relatively powerless, because I think collectively have missed opportunities to do the right thing and intervene much, much earlier, and we've got to be better at this.
So do you think there are questions for the industry?
Sadly, I think there are.
OK, Foreign Secretary, thank you very much indeed for being with us. Always great to have you in the studio. Well, James Cleverly is one of the most senior politicians in the land. What did you think about what he had to say to us this morning? You can email us, kuenssberg@bbc.co.uk. You know we read them. We might get to some at the end of the show. Or if you use social media, you can use the hashtag BBC Laura Kay. Right. Let's get back to our panel then, who are listening intently during all of that. Jane, what did you make then just at the end of the Foreign Secretary saying that the entertainment industry may have questions to answer here? Is that right? You know, you've presented tons of TV shows, you've worked in print for a long time. Do you think there are still inappropriate behaviour that goes on without being...
Well, I would agree. I would agree with that. By the time I got to the end of the documentary last night, there were lots of sort of mentions of freedom of information requests that had sort of fallen on stony ground, not really gone anywhere. So what I think the wider debate about this documentary at the end of it will be, will other people come forward who have worked within the industry who will say, I made a complaint at the time and it was covered up? And that will be across, you know, all mainstream media. There's been quite a few other cases recently, and across various industries as well, if you look at what's happening over at BP. So I think, yes, as he correctly said, where there is a division of power now, times have changed, and I think there needs to be very strict procedures and due process in place that if somebody junior comes forward and says, I've had this issue, rather than going, never mind, you know, we'll sort something out, whatever, and nothing ever comes of it. There needs to be a due process where it's investigated at the time. And this will be interesting, this documentary, in terms of whether anybody else comes forward to add their story, because they felt that at the time they weren't listened to.
I think it's important to have these procedures in place, but I think the culture of the organisation is important as well. I mean, here at the BBC, you've been sitting on that Jimmy Savile dramatisation for ages, because you know it obviously implicates people in power. So every organisation has to get its kind of house in order, so that people can. Do feel comfortable it's an environment that they can come forward and they can be listened to.
But do you think, though, that we have seen change? You know, because it's some years ago, and you mentioned Harvey Weinstein, it's some years ago since we had this sort of opening up of the MeToo conversation. And yet these high-profile cases still seem to be popping up. I mean, how much do you think things have changed, Irvine?
I think they have changed. They've changed for the better, and that women feel more comfortable coming forward, and you know, there's a culture and a bigger environment. It's too much of it, though, seems to sort of kind of go around a kind of, you know, take place in a kind of sort of pitchforky social media type of atmosphere, and where, you know, sort of the women coming forward and making the complaint are instantly demonised, and obviously the people who are the recipients of the complaint are demonised as well. So the arena that this takes place in, I don't think does anybody any favours.
Nimco, I mean, you've spent a long time working on these kinds of issues, particularly trying to combat violence against women and girls.
Yeah, honestly, I think it's a tip of the iceberg. I think the whole point is that we're having these conversations about public figures, but I think there's also, like, you know, real sexual violence within our country and within our communities, and the fact that we have almost 97% of rapists never go to prison or even get prosecuted. So I think we do need to have more of a social contract, like a different social contract, and have that conversation. And I don't want to sit here and demonise all men, but the whole point is, it's really interesting that most women know women who've been raped, but most men don't know anybody who's raped anybody. So there has to be a broader conversation about this.
And what would that mean, that broader conversation?
It's just being honest. It's about actually, I think we do really need, like, you know, better prosecutions. I think we need to set up special courts in order to make sure that both victims and accused actually get to the criminal justice system, and then we're seen to be doing something, because at the moment, like, you know, I think there's a minimum of like a 2 to 3 year wait before anything is even done, and those rapists or the accused are out there with the victims, and then the victims drop out. So I think ultimately we need to start taking these issues more seriously.
There's a lot of narrative at the time, and a lot of narrative online with people where they go, well, why didn't they say anything at the time? And actually they did, some of them. They did go to the police, and they did go to the people that they work for, and nothing happened. So in the end, you end up with this sort of it being put out in the media, which is the only way that they get attention brought to what they, you know, allegedly went through.
And Irvine, I mean, you've got another series of your big TV drama, Crime, coming soon, and abuse is one of the major themes in that. I mean, why is it, do you think, institutions are still failing to confront these kind of problems?
I think, you know, basically because they're male-dominated, and because you're saying that there is no culture for men to address these issues, and I think that, but there's also the kind of the anonymity of it almost, because people don't present in that way to other men. You know, so you can have people that are kind of loyal friends, and then you maybe get talking to women, and they'll say, no, that guy is kind of completely dodgy, there's something really, but, you know, and it's something that they never present to you in that way, and I think that's why the sort of it's not about kind of really so much about men colluding and sort of not identifying sexual predators. When sexual predators get identified by men, they tend to be ostracised very quickly. But there's just that kind of cloak of invisibility around it. I think
having that conversation. So I've got 4 brothers, and I used to tell them that if any of your friends make any rape jokes, either they're a rapist or they're looking for accomplices in the whole kind of conversation. So I think you can sometimes, like, you know, as women, we are vigilant. So I think it's about actually passing that vigilancy onto your brothers and your cousins and all the kind of, like, you know, the male counterparts in your families.
Irvine mentioned there that the arena in which some of these conversations are happening now is often online, which can get very bitter, very vitriolic. In a few days, possibly next week, the government is finally, the online safety bill that's been dragging on for a long time is going to become law. And in a couple of minutes, we'll be talking to Ian Russell, Molly Russell's father. Nimco, as you describe yourself as a millennial, do you think that the government, maybe any government, actually can crack this problem? Because, you know, every family, every young woman, every young man talks about the dark side of the internet.
I think, like, you know, the online bill, the online safety bill, it's a step forward, and I think that's what we need to do. We need to basically be able to take that step and start to address the issue. So it is not just necessarily, so my generation was lucky enough to be on dial-up, so we didn't necessarily have the internet as prolific as it is, but now you have
So it was there, but it was slow.
It was there, it was slow, and it was there, and it was limited, but now the fact that the vast majority of young people are online, and we have this kind of, like, you know, misunderstanding from an analog kind of setting of thinking that the online is completely separate to their physical existence, but young people are living a dual life online and also physically as well. So we have to be able to make that as safe as possible, just as we tell them how safely to cross the road.
Irvine, what do you reckon to the world of social media?
Well, I think it's, you know, it's part of a much bigger problem, in that people, you know, the whole concept of addiction. People are addicted to, you know, the dopamine hits of all, you know, of this kind of.
Do you think it's an addiction?
It's an addiction, and it's like every, you know, people that are, you know, it's like. I mean, I recently wrote a story for a book with John King and Alan Warner, and the story was basically about kind of young kids who've got nothing other than an online life, basically, and they're addicted to everything. They're addicted, you know, they're sexualized through online porn, and, you know, so they don't really know how to operate with a kind of 3D person. They're, you know, they're sort of they can sit in and order Deliveroo and all that, you know, into horrible kind of addictive foods that are just full of salt and sugar.
Through COVID as well, it became basically a whole existence with the fact that some of these young children...
the only door open to the world.
Exactly, we're educated. So I think we also have to understand that the fact that the digital world has kind of changed and actually become a part of their existence.
But it also has to be a pincer movement. I mean, there's obviously certain sections of society where parental influence does not come in, and absolutely they need to be protected by this bill, but also there are a lot of parents out there who, you know, all our lives we say, don't talk to strangers, you know, make sure you get a cab home, whatever. And then sometimes at the age of 9, we hand a child a device that gives access to every sort of bad person in the world and can get at them through this phone, and the parents are ignorant of that, and they need to educate themselves.
And also parents are sitting on their own phone telling their kids to get off their phone. You know, it's not necessarily something that just the younger generation have to grapple with, and the government's plans have been very, well, they've taken an awful long time to get through, with all sorts of interesting arguments and debates about it. Thank you all very much indeed for now. We'll be back with you a bit later in the show. So as we've been hearing, managing what happens online sometimes feels like the challenge of a generation, felt by almost every family. And the response from all of you to the actress Kate Winslet's call for action after she made the drama I Am Ruth about what can go wrong was huge.
The people who know that they could do better to protect our children should just be doing that. Whoever those people are, they know who they are, they should just step up and do better.
Well, as we've been hearing, the government's online safety bill, which campaigners have been fighting for, is at last in its final stages. But do the families who've worked so hard to make it happen think it does the job? We're privileged to have Ian Russell with us today, the father of Molly Russell, who ended her life aged just 14 after seeing images of self-harm online. Ian, welcome very much to the programme.
Thank you, Laura.
Will this bill make the online world safer for kids online?
This bill will make the online world safer. I'm convinced. It's not perfect, I should say. They were saying that in the Commons on Tuesday when it was debated there. But it's an important step. And it's a step that's been needed for years to counter this new technology, to counter these changes that are happening so fast that society doesn't quite know what to do with.
And where are the gaps, though?
The gaps in the bill will come out. I think the gaps are all to do with how fast tech changes. There's been a lot of talk recently over new technologies like AI, for example. The bill is designed to be future-proof. It's not intended to be sort of technology specific. It doesn't deal in the internet as we know it today. It's trying to set sort of protocols for the future, or for future tech. But who's to say what might happen in the future? And as new technologies emerge, there will be emerging harms that come with them.
You've worked so hard and for such a long time along with other campaigners. Will the measures that have been put forward actually stop the kind of images that Molly saw being seen by other children?
Well, that's the test of the bill. There are many other families, it's not just me, who have been campaigning for better online safety, and the bereaved families for online safety group, for example, have too many tragic stories to tell, some like Molly's and some quite different. But if the bill fails to stop online harms that all our children saw, then it will have failed. So it has to go further. And now, once this becomes law, we're in a new phase. We're in a new phase where Ofcom, as the regulator appointed by the government to police the internet, if you like, to regulate the tech industry, has to get out of the blocks really fast. It can't waste time. It has to move fast and be bold and enact the clauses set out in the bill in order to make the online world safer for children. And
Ofcom sort of become the policeman, really, don't they? Are you confident that they've got the expertise to do it, that they've got the knowledge to do it?
Ofcom have got a really tough job. They're going up against some of the biggest, most well-funded corporations on the planet. But they have already been staffing up. They've got hundreds of people working on online safety already. I'm sure they will be recruiting more people. And those people are drawn from all sorts of society. People who have been policing the digital world or trying to police the digital world, former police people, former tech people, and of course former legal people as well, to advise them about how they can go about making the world safe.
But do you think it's realistic though, if you think you've got a regulator based in London with a few hundred staff, you know, doing their best, I'm sure, up against Google, Twitter, well X we should call it these days, these huge tech platforms? I mean, that's David and Goliath, isn't it?
It's a bit David and Goliath. That's not a reason for not doing it. That's a reason, you know, for having to consider this. The fact that this bill's been a long time through Parliament has been really frustrating for those of us who've lost children, who've been affected. But that length of time has allowed it to be scrutinised hugely. The political process has been really, really thorough. And I think Ofcom have got a really good platform. The legislation seems to me, it's a draft framework, there needs to be secondary legislation. Ofcom needs to draft codes of practice. There's much still to do, but the base where we are now is that important first step. And along with other countries around the world, like Australia and Europe, and even in the US now, it's online safety is a bigger and more public aware priority. That is what will change the world, when the world gets together.
So the first step has been taken, and it is a significant step. What would the next one be that you would like to see? So there were conversations about jail terms for tech bosses who refused to follow the rules. What would you want to do?
So I thought always that jail terms for tech bosses was important, not because I don't think tech bosses will ever end up going to jail, but I think it focuses their minds. And what is really needed is a change of corporate culture at these big institutions. They've 2 decades of social media, and nothing's really changed. From the dorms to the boardrooms, they've run their companies, and things need to change. I've seen the harms that Molly saw. One of the problems with telling this story is it's really hard to communicate that. I can't show you those harms on television. You're not allowed to show them. Papers can't print them. But I've seen them. The coroner saw the harms during the inquest, and every single person there thought they were appalling, with one exception. And that was the witness that came from Silicon Valley that Meta supplied and gave evidence under oath. And Elizabeth Lagone was the only person I've ever come across who, barring a couple of exceptions, said that the content that Molly had seen was safe. While there are executives in big tech platforms who still think that, then children are still in danger when they're online.
At the start of this, you were rather a lone voice, and it's been a long journey. What's it been like for you, and what's it been like for you as a family?
It's been difficult, but it was always going to be difficult, because at the heart of this story is the loss of our lovely, adorable Molly. But there have been so many other people who've supported this journey, so many people who really think it's important that the world should be safer for children. If you think of NSPCC research that was commissioned last year, University of Swansea studies showed that 3/4 of young people had seen online harms by the time they were 14, and 83% of those, this is the significant thing, 83% of young people who'd seen those online harms didn't go searching for it, it found them. And while the platform's algorithms are feeding harms to our children, we have to do something.
And you've taken an extraordinary and terrible loss and turned it into concrete action. Do you think Molly would be proud of what you've achieved?
I hope Molly would be proud, but there are so many other voices who are joining this cause, sadly, in the main because they've also lost children. And we hope that this step, the new online safety bill, will mean there are fewer of those families and fewer of stories like Molly's in the future.
Ian, thank you so much indeed for coming and sharing your story and talking about your tireless campaigning with us in the studio this morning. It's been a pleasure to have you.
Thanks,
Laura.
Laura.
Much indeed. Thank you. Now, this week, Keir Starmer has been on his travels, trying to show the world he's not just the leader of the opposition, he's an international statesman in waiting. In the middle of the week, he was in The Hague to push his plans to crack down on immigration with strong vows to smash the gangs by working more closely with European institutions. And this weekend, he's been in Canada, hanging out with like-minded leaders on the left. There is his Kodak moment with the Canadian leader, Justin Trudeau. And tomorrow, he's in France to meet President Macron. But this morning, we are meeting Pat McFadden, who has a new fancy job, the shadow of the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. A bit of a mouthful, but basically, Keir Starmer's Mr. Fix-It. And you're also going to be in charge of the election campaign. So a very big job. Now, I said at the start of the programme, you'd been described as the most powerful Labour politician no one had really heard of. I hope you don't take offence to that. But do you think you are?
I don't think anybody in opposition is powerful. The point is to change that. In opposition, you can only talk. In government, you can do so. I don't mind who's heard of me or not, but it's the notion of somebody being in opposition and powerful that I kind of struggle to get.
OK, well, let's talk about what you might do if you do win power. Labour's been talking a lot about the EU in the last couple of days and working with institutions to try to combat particularly the problem of migration. But what's a voter who chose to leave the EU meant to think when they hear your shadow foreign secretary say closer links with the EU are a top priority for Labour?
We're not going to rerun the Brexit argument. We left the EU. The task for the country is to make the best future that we can outside the EU. But that doesn't mean everything stays as it is. So we want to have an adult and positive relationship with the EU. We want Britain to be as powerful as it can around the world. We are leading members of NATO. We're permanent members of the UN Security Council. We've got considerable soft power, cultural power around the world. We've got to use all these things for the best benefit of the country and the things that we believe in.
But why does that mean making the EU a top priority, to use David Lammy's phrase? I mean, to win a majority, you have to win back seats like Bolsover or Ashfield or Dudley North, not far from your own constituency, where the Leave vote was about 70%. And then voters will hear you say the EU is a top priority, closer links with the institution. They wanted to leave. Doesn't that send people a message that actually you're snubbing their desire?
It shouldn't. We're not going to rerun the argument. As I said, the Brexit vote happened 7 years ago.
I'm asking you what impression, though, that gives to voters if Labour is saying, we want closer links with the EU. Now, rightly or wrongly, I think a lot of Brexit voters might hear that and think, hang on a minute, you're going against what we told our politicians to do.
We're not doing that, but we still have important values that coincide with those countries. If you look at Russia's invasion of Ukraine, some of the things that we were arguing about in recent years seem pretty pale by comparison. We've got an important trading relationship. We've got some common problems. It makes sense to have an adult and positive relationship. Let's give an example from just a few days ago. The UK has just decided to rejoin the Horizon University research project. That's a sensible thing to do. It doesn't mean you have to rejoin the European Union, but it does mean there are areas where you can work together.
But with working together, normally in politics and diplomacy, there is a quid pro quo. You know that very well. Now, Keir Starmer this week has been pushing the immigration plan, saying that he would get a returns deal with the EU, and that might involve the UK accepting a share of migrants that arrive on the continent. Now, Labour has rejected the Tories' claims that means 100,000 extra people would come. But would you put a limit on the number of extra migrants from the continent that Labour would be prepared to accept?
Well, we said two important things in recent days. Keir Starmer and my colleague Yvette Cooper, the Shadow Home Secretary, went to visit Europol. And the first thing was we need better international crime-fighting cooperation on people smuggling gangs that organise this operation. The second thing was we need to do something to tackle this backlog. We are spending £2 billion a year on hotel accommodation all over the country.
And that point was made by your colleagues earlier this week.
We need to do.
But my question this morning is whether or not you would put a limit on the number of migrants that a Labour government would be willing to accept from the continent as part of a returns deal, the returns deal that your party says you want in order to be able to better to confront the problem. Would you put a limit on the number?
Well, on limits and controls, first of all, right now, people smugglers are basically half running the asylum system by deciding who comes on these boats. So we've got to crack down on that. In terms of discussions with the EU, there's been a lot of nonsense talked about this in recent days. We're not going to be taking part in an EU-wide scheme involving EU member states, because we're not a member state.
But you have said that you would negotiate with individual countries, and I'm asking you a clear question. You can say the Tories' claims were nonsense, that's your prerogative, they will dispute that, and you can fight that out amongst yourselves. But I'm asking you a clear question. Would a Labour government put a limit on the number of migrants that you might be willing to accept in negotiations?
I'm not sure it will work like that, because you're implying as though there is some kind of negotiation about numbers and quotas. What my colleague, the Shadow Home Secretary, has talked about is family reunion. Children who may have strong links here in the UK. At the moment, those people who may or may not have a legitimate claim, they are coming on these small boats. And, you know, that's the kind of thing we're talking about, rather than taking part in some EU-wide quota.
But if you have a returns deal, though, do you accept there would have to be some kind of quid pro quo? And our voters, our viewers this morning will hear that you are not saying whether or not you put a limit on any potential numbers.
I don't think it's going to be an allocation of numbers. We're talking about individual cases where a child may have strong family links here. It's not, we'll take this many, you take that many. That's not the kind of negotiation that we want to have.
OK, well, let's see where that debate ends up. I think that we've had a bit of a taste of the election campaign with the two parties trading blows over immigration. Now, as we said, you will be in charge of the Labour election campaign. And this week, me and some other journalists have been able to get our sticky paws on the document that you will use as a menu from which to pick your proposals from the manifesto. Now, let's see if we can get you to say if some of them might make the cut. Now, in that document, you've committed to delivering HS2 high-speed rail in full. Now, the government appears to be wobbling, but would a Labour manifesto explicitly commit to the full original route of high-speed rail being built?
Well, we want to see the railway being built. It looks as though the government is now putting a question mark over this. There may be revised costs to that. When this started, a price tag of about £30 billion was put on it. Those prices haven't been raised since 2019. We've had quite a lot of inflation since then. So I want to see what happens in the coming months. We want to see the railway being built, but we've also, like everything else, got to look at the costs of everything that we do.
So you won't commit right now to completing the full original route on HS2, that's clear?
I want to see what this costs, and we'll make those decisions when it comes to the manifesto.
OK. We know a lot of people watching, our inbox is always full of this, are truly desperate about the holes in social care for the elderly and most vulnerable in the country. Can you commit that the manifesto will have a publicly funded and free at the point of use national care service, which your Shadow Health Secretary says he wants?
We want a national care service, but I'm not sure you've described it in the way that I would. This is about standards. across a very varied industry. It's not about nationalising everything in the care industry. It's about ensuring that it operates to good standards with properly paid staff who are treated well, so that the people in that care service are looked after as well as possible. That's what we mean by a national care service. The way you put it there, I'm not sure if you meant it was...
Wes Streeting said, I'd love to see publicly owned, publicly funded, free at the point of use.
I don't think he's going to go around and nationalise every care home.
OK, well, that's interesting that you say that. I wonder what he might say about that. What about the triple lock on pensions? Now, that keeps pensions rising either with inflation, earnings, or 2.5%, whichever is higher, and it's going to be very expensive for the government this year. Your colleague, the Deputy Leader, Angela Rayner, didn't commit to keeping this earlier this week. Will the triple lock be in the Labour manifesto?
Look, all of these things, the triple lock has raised pensions quite a lot in the last decade or so. All of these big ticket items are going to depend on the state of the economy at the time. And the manifesto will take that into account when the election comes, probably in about a year's time.
So again, at this stage then, that is clear. Labour is not committed to keeping the triple lock at this stage because it depends what happens.
Committed to keeping the triple lock now. What we have to say about the future Parliament will come when we draw up the manifesto.
But the election is probably going to be in 2024. I mean, you can't say if you're committed to keeping the triple lock now, but you're not committed to keeping it next year.
Well, we write the manifesto when the election comes.
OK. The Labour Party conference is next month. It's a big week for the party, especially given where things are in the sort of runway to the general election. And members around the country who'll be packing their backpacks to go have been starting to receive their conference programmes through the post this week, we understand. I just want to show people the cover of the conference programme. I think we can do that. There's your leader just there. Can you tell us where Keir Starmer got his inspiration for the cover of the programme?
I really can't. It's a very nice photograph. I think he looks good in that.
Do you think maybe he got his inspiration from a very similar thing from the 1997 manifesto with Tony Blair on the front? I mean, you used to work for Tony Blair. There's been quite a lot of perhaps mischief made about all of the Blairites now controlling Keir Starmer, and I'm sure you're going to say that's not the situation. But you've worked for both men. What's the difference?
Well, they're different people. And I find,
in what ways?
I find all this thing about Blairites, I mean, I think after 16 years out of power, whatever it is, maybe a new lexicon is needed. Keir Starmer's his own man.
So tell us what's the difference then? If the stuff about Blairites is wrong, what's the difference between the two men? You know them both well.
Different people for different times is the difference. What they have in common...
But that sounds like a slogan. What's the difference between them as leaders and as bosses? Who's a more fun boss?
They're both very good men, and I worked closely with both of them. I think what they have in common is maybe more important than the differences. And what they have in common is they really want a Labour Party that's facing the public rather than talking to itself. That hasn't always been true in recent years. So it's going to be a changed Labour Party, and in the nick of time, because the thought of a fifth term of the Conservatives after the mess they've made in the past 13 years doesn't bear thinking about. So I think we have got our act together considerably since Keir Starmer became leader. He's changed the focus of the Labour Party to look more outwards. And the question that he wants answered at conference is, if not the Tories, then why us? And that's what we'll be about at this year's conference.
Why you? Well, indeed, I'm sure that's a question we'll ask Keir Starmer in the next couple of weeks. I think we'll be speaking to him at the party conference, so it's been great having you in the studio this morning, Pat McFadden. Now, it is getting close to 10 o'clock. Remember, at the start of the show, it feels like a lifetime ago already, we asked the Foreign Secretary for his response to the Russell Brand scandal.
We have to be particularly careful when we listen to the voices of the people who are relatively powerless. Because we, I think, collectively have missed opportunities to do the right thing and intervene much, much earlier.
And lots of you have been getting in touch. As ever, there's lots of your mind. Jonathan Evans says he no longer believes what the Tories say. He says we've increased migrant crossings in boats. There's no growth in our economy. The country wants an election now. But Martin Axford got in touch about Libya and the terrible situation there. He said all European countries have a responsibility to sort this, or suffer the consequences, i.e. migrants crossing the Med. And on foreign aid, Trevor Davis says, I'm sorry, but charity begins at home. Let's get our own house in order before we try to sort the world out. All sorts of things on your mind and really interesting responses to our conversations this morning. Jane, what did you think of what Pat McFadden was saying? Right, this is a big political autumn, isn't it? Conferences are coming fast. Labour's been ahead for ages, but, you know, we've heard there just from some of our emailers, you know, people are, you know, angry about things, but are Labour really on course, do you think?
Well, I think, as ever with all politicians, again, you don't ever really get a straight answer to anything. And I understand why they're going into an election. They don't want to frighten the horses by coming up with something where they feel that somebody might not vote for them because of it. But there was a poll today that a third of adults are now what they're classed as super distrusters of politicians. Again, what was about social media, they're all talking to each other on social media, they've got their own narrative going on, they're not really listening. So I think the biggest challenge for both major parties next year is going to be voter apathy.
Well, Irvine, what do you reckon to that? I mean, you said earlier this week, I think, that we were having this sort of nervous breakdown. Do you think that is the case? People just don't trust?
Yeah, I think people don't trust politicians, and I think they're absolutely right not to. You've seen a government just basically kind of feathering the nest of its cronies during COVID, and you know, shorten the pound and Brexit and all this kind of stuff. It's seen as it's basically they're basically looting the taxpayers' money, and this is like. But this is the phenomenon. We've set up these global technological and financial systems that really it doesn't matter what kind of party gets into power. There's no difference between the two parties.
You think they're all the same now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they're all the same, and I think they can't be anything other than the same. That's the whole issue about it.
What about the SNP? I mean, you are somebody who's on the side of Scottish independence.
Again, the SNP are the same. They've tried to they tried to do a sort of a social democratic thing. They're still trying to keep that flag alive in some ways with kind of prescriptions and education policy. But they're being pushed into that whole neoliberal model by the sort of by the dictates of the whole kind of financial and technostructure.
Nimco, you've been around politics a lot. I mean, but you described yourself earlier as a lost millennial. I mean, do you think that's fair that the parties are all the same?
And they're all the same, and I think that's because of our first past the post system and the fact that they consistently have to kind of agree on the same kind of issues. I think we do need more election reform as opposed to talking about different politicians. But ultimately, I do think that, that Labour is getting its act together, and Keir Starmer's my local MP, and
mine as well.
Yeah. Oh,
goodness me, we've got two constituents and two people who know.
I thought I saw him today in a tracksuit, but apparently not, because he's on his travels. So he's got a bit of a doppelganger.
Yeah, part of the biggest issue.
There's a story. Summer in Camden is a Keir Starmer doppelganger.
But yeah, I mean, I would abolish voting. Basically, I would have a lottery system. I would have everybody takes part in a lottery, 650 names drawn out of the hat. That's your MPs. Another lottery, 40 names. And another lottery from that, the Prime Minister. Now, what that would do is we would just crush the lobby system. It would crush all the nepotism and all the networks, and you'd have to have an education
system. Would you put yourself forward to be in the lottery?
No,
it's a whole new format for the Sunday morning political conversation.
It would be compulsive. Everybody would have a lottery ticket. Every adult would have a lottery ticket. And that would make it incumbent on the society to have a proper education system, in things like science and civics.
I think that will probably lead to dictatorships and
being
corruption. So somebody that's seen civil war, I don't necessarily think that's the best kind of way for our democracy.
We've all won a lottery ticket by having the three of you with us at the table this morning and give us such an interesting range of insights. Irvine, your next series of crime is on ITV when?
Thursday, I believe, yeah.
Thursday, there you go. Thank you all three of you so much for joining us. Big thanks to my gang at the desk, Irvine Welsh, Jane Moore and Nimco Ali. And thank you, of course, most of all, to you for watching. After a week when our politicians have been reminded it's hard to control events at home, but it's even trickier to respond to and shape events further afield. And I think there's definitely been a taste in that battle on immigration of what the election is going to be like. We'll of course be here every week doing our very best to make sense of it all. In a second, I'll be joining Paddy O'Connell. There he is. Is he going to wave? I'm hoping he's going to wave today. He did. He waved. We'll be together shortly for our weekend newscast. You can catch that on BBC Sounds later. You can get anything you missed here on iPlayer, and if that isn't enough, the next episode of our series State of Chaos is on iPlayer and BBC Two from tomorrow. Plenty to be getting on with. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. Look forward to being with you next week. Same time, same place, but goodbye for now.